I have sat in this chair for over 30 years. 30 years of watching human beings walk through that door carrying the full weight of their worst decisions, their worst days, their worst selves. I have heard every lie dressed up as explanation, every manipulation disguised as misunderstanding, every performance of innocence rehearsed so thoroughly the performer has started to believe it themselves. In 3 decades on this bench, I thought I had seen everything this courtroom could produce. I was wrong. Because nothing, not one case, not one defendant, not one attorney in 30 years, had ever prepared me for the morning a United States senator walked into my courtroom, looked up at my bench like he owned the building, and quietly informed me that my career existed at his convenience. That morning didn't just test my patience. It tested the bones of everything this room is built to protect. And if you believe, as I do, as I have always believed, with every fiber of professional conviction I possess, that this law is not a shield for the powerful and a sword for everyone else, then you need to hear every single word of what happened next. Because what walked into this courtroom that morning was not just a man. It was the oldest lie in the history of power. And it walked into the wrong room. It was a sharp Monday in November. The kind of cold that doesn't wait for you to open the door. It's already inside when you arrive. I walked in at 8:50 a.m., coffee in hand, expecting the organized chaos that defines every morning in this building. People conferring with attorneys. Families packed into gallery rows. The low, anxious hum of a room full of people who need something resolved. But the moment I crossed that threshold, I knew. The room was wrong. Not loud wrong. Quiet wrong. The kind of silence that tells you something has already happened before you arrived, and the room is simply waiting for you to catch up. My clerk, Michael, was standing instead of sitting. Michael never stands. His face had gone the color of old chalk. He didn't say good morning. He didn't hand me the docket. He simply looked toward the gallery and said, very quietly, Judge. Front row. I put on my glasses and looked up. Sitting in the public gallery, right where ordinary people sit, right where families and witnesses and court watchers sit, was a man in a dark navy suit that had not been purchased anywhere near the city. American flag thin on the lapel. 2 aides and a personal attorney arranged behind him like furniture. He was sitting with the particular, deliberate stillness of someone who has already decided how the morning ends. And he was staring at my bench the way a man stares at something he has already decided belongs to him. Senator Victor Caldwell. 3 terms in office. Presidential ambitions loud enough that staffers lowered their voices when his name came up. The kind of political capital that doesn't ask for rooms, it expects them to clear. I looked down at the docket. The name on the file read, Natalie Caldwell, age 26. Aggravated assault. Reckless endangerment. Fleeing the scene of an accident. His daughter. What he didn't know, what he was about to find out, was that he had walked into the wrong courtroom. I banged the gavel and called the session to order. Before the bailiff had finished the announcement, before I had drawn breath to begin, Senator Caldwell stood up. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't wait to be recognized. He didn't do any of the things that every other human being in that room understood were required of them the moment they walked through those doors. He simply stood, buttoned his jacket with the unhurried ease of a man adjusting before a board meeting, and walked through the swinging gate into the well of my courtroom, the space that belongs to attorneys and defendants and officers of the court, and to absolutely no one else, without my explicit permission. My bailiff stepped forward. I held up one finger. I wanted to hear this. The senator stopped in front of my bench and looked up at me with a smile I can only describe as patient. The smile of a man who is accustomed to people understanding things without needing to be told twice. He clasped his hands in front of him. Then he said, Your Honor, except the way he said it made it sound like anything but. The words were technically correct, but the tone carried none of the weight they were built to hold. It landed the way you'd address a colleague you've already decided is junior to you. Polite enough on the surface, dismissive underneath. The specific brand of courtesy that is really just condescension wearing a tie. This case, he said, is a politically motivated mischaracterization of a minor traffic incident involving my daughter. I think we both know that I sit on the Federal Judiciary Oversight Committee, and I have a genuine interest in seeing that the resources of this court are directed toward matters that actually warrant them. He paused. The smile didn't move. I would simply encourage you to consider the implications of how this morning proceeds for everyone involved. He said it pleasantly, calmly, the way you'd recommend a restaurant. No raised voice, no pointed finger, just the smooth, ambient pressure of a man who has spent 3 terms in office learning that the most effective threats are the ones that never sound like threats at all. I took my glasses off. I set them on the bench in front of me, slowly, deliberately, the way I do when I need my hands free and my eyes clear, and every person in the room to understand that what comes next will not be negotiated. The gallery did not make a sound. Not one. I told the senator to return behind the bar or I would have him removed, in the same tone I use for everything in this room, level, final, not interested in discussion. He held my gaze for a moment longer than was wise. Then he turned and walked back to the front row with the controlled calm of a man who has decided to try a different approach. He sat down. He crossed one leg over the other. He was not finished. But neither was I. Mr. Webb, I said. Please proceed. Marcus Webb stood up. I will tell you plainly, that young man looked like he was holding himself together through sheer force of professional obligation. 28 years old. 8 months into his first prosecutorial position. He had prepared for this case. He had not prepared for the senator. The difference between those two things was written all over his face in a way the entire gallery could read. His hands holding his notes were not steady. But he stood up. That matters. He stood up anyway. Your Honor, he began, his voice finding its footing as he went. On Saturday, November 9th, at approximately 11:20 in the morning, the defendant, Natalie Caldwell, drove a 2023 Range Rover into the pedestrian zone of the city's weekly farmers market on Clement Street. She was traveling at a speed later estimated by 2 independent witnesses at between 35 and 40 miles per hour in a zone where no vehicle traffic is permitted. He paused. 4 people were injured. 1 required hospitalization for a broken wrist. 2 others sustained lacerations. The 4th was Dorothy Okafor. I looked toward the gallery. Dorothy was sitting in the 3rd row, arm in a sling, cheeks still carrying the faint, yellowed shadow of a fracture that had not fully resolved. She was sitting perfectly straight, watching Marcus Webb with the patient, unblinking attention of a woman who has waited a long time for her name to be said in a room like this. Miss Okafor is 71 years old, Marcus continued. She is a retired schoolteacher. Every Saturday, she sets up a display of homemade preserves and baked goods, items she has been preparing since the previous Tuesday. He stopped briefly. Her entire display was destroyed. 6 months of work. Gone in seconds. The senator did not react. Natalie did not look up. When Miss Okafor approached the vehicle, not in anger, Your Honor, but out of concern, Natalie Caldwell got out of the car, screaming that the vendors had no business being in the road. When Miss Okafor attempted to respond, the defendant struck her across the face with an open hand. He set down his notes. Miss Okafor suffered a fractured cheekbone and a torn rotator cuff from the fall that followed. She spent 4 days in the hospital. A bystander recorded 15 seconds of footage, Your Honor. It leaves no room for interpretation. The room was very quiet. I looked at Dorothy Okafor. She was still sitting straight. And across the room, at the defense table, Natalie Caldwell still had not looked up from her phone, which told me everything I needed to know about what the next portion of this morning was going to require. I had been watching Natalie Caldwell since the moment Marcus Webb began speaking. What I observed was this. Nothing. Not a flinch at the mention of Dorothy's name. Not a shift in posture when the fracture was described. Not a flicker of anything when Marcus said 4 days in the hospital. She was sitting at the defense table in a jacket tailored specifically to her measurements, her hair arranged with the kind of effortless precision that requires considerable effort. Looking at her phone beneath the edge of the table with the practiced subtlety of someone who has been told not to and has decided that instruction applies to other people. She was surrounded by 4 attorneys. Not public defenders. Not local counsel. Specialists flown in, the kind who bill in increments that most people in this city will never earn in a month, who carry themselves with the specific, polished confidence of professionals whose clients' problems have a consistent habit of disappearing before trial. They were arranged around Natalie like a perimeter, and two of them were watching the senator with the calibrated alertness of people waiting for a signal. I let Marcus finish. Then I looked directly at the defense table. Miss Caldwell, how do you plead? Gerald Ferris was on his feet before Natalie had drawn breath to respond. He informed the court that his client entered a plea of not guilty and, before I could respond, pivoted immediately into a motion to suppress the bystander footage on the grounds that it had been recorded without the defendant's consent in a semi-public space and that its provenance and chain of custody had not been formally established. Natalie did not look up from her phone. I looked at Gerald Ferris for a long moment. Then I looked past him at his client. Then I looked at Dorothy Okafor in the third row, arm in its sling, watching the defense table with the quiet, undemanding attention of a woman who has simply come to this room to see whether it is what it claims to be. I picked up my pen. We were going to find out. I called a 30-minute recess at 10:15 to review the suppression motion and give Marcus time to pull the chain of custody documentation the defense was challenging. Standard procedure. I expected to return to a room in roughly the same condition I had left it. What I did not expect was the look on Marcus Webb's face when he walked back through that door. I had spent 30 years learning to read faces in this room. I knew what a prosecutor looked like when shaken by facts. This was not that. This was the face of someone who had just been asked to make a decision he had not anticipated making today, and who was still, visibly, in the process of making it. He sat down at his table. He arranged his papers. He did not look at me. I watched him for a moment. Then I leaned into the microphone. Mr. Webb. He looked up. During the recess, did anyone approach you regarding this case? The courtroom, which had been settling back into its seats, went absolutely still again. Marcus Webb looked at me. He looked at his papers. He looked at the senator, who was back in the front row, legs crossed, expression neutral in the precise, effortful way that expressions are neutral when someone is working very hard to keep them that way. For seconds passed. I counted them. In 30 years, I have learned that 4 seconds of silence from an officer of this court is not nothing. 4 seconds is a decision being made in real time, in full view of everyone watching. Then Marcus Webb straightened in his chair, looked directly at me, and said, "Yes, Your Honor." Senator Caldwell approached me in the corridor outside the records office. He indicated that if I were to recommend dismissal of the current charges, he could ensure prosecutorial discretion on an unrelated matter currently under review by his office. A pause. 3 people were present in that corridor. I have their names. Nobody in that room moved. I looked at Senator Victor Caldwell. He uncrossed his legs. And for the first time since he had walked through my door that morning, the smile was gone. Completely, finally gone. And in that moment, everything that followed became inevitable. I took my glasses off. I set my pen down. I folded my hands on the bench and looked at the senator with the complete, unhurried stillness I reserve for moments when everything that follows is already decided, and the only remaining question is how long it takes the room to understand it. What Marcus Webb had just described on the record, in open session, with 3 named witnesses, was not ambiguous. It was not subject to interpretation. It was not a matter requiring deliberation. It was attempted bribery of a prosecuting attorney during active court proceedings on courthouse property in a case currently before this bench. There is only one thing a judge does when those facts are placed before her. Officer Reyes. He was already watching me. Senator Caldwell. What Mr. Webb has described on the record before this court constitutes attempted bribery of a court officer and obstruction of justice. It occurred on courthouse property during active proceedings. It has been reported by the prosecutor himself and corroborated by 3 witnesses. I paused for exactly 1 second. Officer Reyes placed Senator Caldwell under arrest. Reyes moved. The senator's 2 aides stepped back, not toward him, away from him, with the involuntary calculation of people who have just assessed their own exposure and decided that distance is the only sensible response. His personal attorney opened his mouth, produced no sound, and closed it again. Gerald Ferris at the defense table went perfectly still. The senator stood as the handcuffs closed, and I will say this for him. He stood straight. But straightness is not dignity when the handcuffs are real. And every person in that gallery understood the difference with absolute clarity. Officer Reyes walked him toward the door. The senator did not speak. He did not look at his daughter. He looked straight ahead with the expression of a man who had entered this room as the most powerful person in it and was now leaving it in a way he had never once, in 30 years of wielding power, considered possible. When he buttoned his jacket this morning, he thought he was walking into a negotiation. The doors opened. The gallery turned. Not with noise, with something colder and more final than noise. Every face in that room watched him go. Not one of them looked away. The doors closed. The defense table came apart, not loudly. Gerald Ferris was too experienced for loud, but visibly, structurally, the way things come apart when the load-bearing element is suddenly removed. Ferris turned to his associates, and the three of them converged in urgent, low-voiced conference. The junior attorneys wore the expressions of people who had flown in to manage one problem and had just become part of an entirely different one. And Natalie Caldwell, for the first time since she had taken her seat that morning, looked up from her phone. She was staring at the doors. Just staring at them, the doors her father had been walked through 30 seconds ago, with the expression of someone who has just discovered that the floor she has been standing on her entire life is not floor at all. I did not give the defense table time to regroup. Miss Caldwell. My voice was even, controlled, final. I am denying bail. You have the financial resources and international connections to constitute a demonstrated flight risk, and the events of this morning have given this court no reason to extend good faith on that question. I am ordering your passport seized pending the conclusion of these proceedings. I am also adding the matter of attempted bribery as a related charge to this docket, given that it occurred in direct connection with your case and on courthouse property. That was when Natalie began to cry. Not quietly. Not with the restrained dignity of someone genuinely sorry for the harm they have caused another person, but the panicked, disbelieving, gasping tears of someone who has never once in her life been required to sit with a consequence and has just been informed that sitting with this one is not optional, not negotiable, not something any amount of money or connections or tailored jackets can rearrange. I watched her for a moment. Then I said, Miss Caldwell, you are not crying for Dorothy Okafor. You are crying for yourself. Those are two very different things. And this court knows the difference. By the time I was ready to deliver the verdict, Natalie's crying had subsided into silence, not the silence of acceptance, but the exhausted silence of a person who has run out of performances and has nothing left to substitute for the real thing. Gerald Ferris sat beside her with his hands folded on the table. A man who had arrived this morning with a strategy and was now simply present, which was, honestly, the most authentic thing he had done all day. I straightened the file. I put my glasses back on. Natalie Caldwell, I find you guilty on all counts. Aggravated assault. Reckless endangerment. Fleeing the scene of an accident. Here is your sentence. You will serve 2 years in a state correctional facility. You will complete 400 hours of community service upon release, assigned specifically to food banks and community markets, the kinds of places and the kinds of people that you drove through on a Saturday morning without once slowing down. You will undergo mandatory psychological evaluation because consequences without understanding produce nothing durable. You will compose, by hand, without attorney assistance, a formal letter of apology to Dorothy Okafor, and you will read it aloud in this courtroom before you are remanded today. You will also record an unscripted video statement. No preparation, no legal coaching, no second takes, taking full and personal responsibility for your actions. That statement will be broadcast across your father's official political platforms and your own social media. The public that watched 15 seconds of footage deserves to hear the full accounting directly from you. Marcus Webb stood. He did not shake. He requested formally, on the record, the passport seizure and the addition of the bribery charge to the active docket. His voice was steady and clear, the voice of someone who had been tested that morning in ways no training prepares you for, and had passed anyway, had passed when it cost something to do so. Then Dorothy Okafor rose from her seat. She stood slowly, with her arm in its sling, and she walked to the center of the room with the kind of unhurried, unperformative dignity that cannot be taught and cannot be faked. She looked at me. She did not ask for anything more. She did not enumerate what had been taken from her or demand the record reflect her suffering in greater detail. She said 3 words. She saw me. I looked at Dorothy Okafor, 71 years old, retired schoolteacher, fractured cheekbone, 4 days in a hospital, 6 months of work destroyed in seconds on a Saturday morning by someone who never once looked at her as a person. You were always visible, Miss Okafor, I said. This room simply made it official. The gavel came down. And for the first time all morning, the silence that followed felt like something had been restored rather than something had been lost. The story didn't end when the gavel came down. In many ways, it was only beginning. For people in that gallery had their phones out when Officer Reyes walked Senator Caldwell through those doors. For separate angles. For simultaneous uploads. By the time I had signed the remand order and called the session closed, the footage was already moving faster than anyone in his office could contain it. 18 million views before midnight. Every major network had it on their morning broadcast. The image of a 3-term senator, dark navy suit, American flag pin still on his lapel, being walked out of a courtroom in handcuffs became the kind of image people reference for years when they're trying to explain what accountability actually looks like when it arrives without warning. The FBI opened a formal investigation within 48 hours. What they found took 11 months to fully document and required a task force across 3 states. A decade of judicial interference. Campaign finance fraud totaling tens of millions of dollars. 14 suppressed police reports involving members of the Caldwell family and their associates, reports buried so thoroughly that several of the officers who filed them had long since assumed they were simply lost. Senator Victor Caldwell was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. He resigned his seat from custody in a letter his attorney released on his behalf that contained no apology and did not mention Dorothy Okafor by name. Natalie Caldwell served her sentence. She completed her community service hours at 2 food banks and 1 farmer's market, the same Saturday market on Clement Street where Dorothy Okafor still sets up her table every week. They did not become friends, but they became something. 2 women who share one single morning that altered both of their lives, working out in their own time, in their own way, the long and unglamorous distance between damage and repair. Dorothy received $400,000 in public donations within 72 hours of the footage going viral. She did not retire. She expanded. She named her new permanent stall after the morning she walked to the center of a courtroom and refused to ask for anything except to be seen. Marcus Webb was offered a senior prosecutor position before the year was out. He took it without hesitation. As for me, I looked at the clock at 11:14 that morning, looked at my clerk Michael, and said, "Call the next case." It was a parking violation. A confused, elderly gentleman who had misread the sign. I waived the fine, wished him a good afternoon, and moved on. The law does not stop for senators. It certainly doesn't stop for me. I want to say something directly to everyone who has read this, because I have thought about that morning many times since the gavel came down, and I believe it deserves to be said plainly. This story is not about hating the powerful. It is not about politics or a party, or which side of any aisle you stand on. It is about something far simpler and far more important than any of that. It is about one question, a question this bench has to answer every single morning it opens for business. Whether the law that applies to the confused elderly man with the parking ticket is genuinely, actually, without exception the same law that applies to the senator in the navy suit with the flag pin and the presidential ambitions. That morning in this room, the answer was yes. It has to always be yes. The moment it becomes conditional, the moment we begin deciding that certain titles make certain people exempt, we stop being a court. We become something else entirely. Something that serves power instead of checking it. Something that protects the floor beneath the feet of people like Natalie Caldwell while making people like Dorothy Okafor invisible. Dorothy Okafor walked to the center of this room and said 3 words. She saw me. That is what this bench is for. Not for the senator. For her. For the teacher crossing the street. For the vendor at the Saturday market. For every single person who walks through that door hoping, sometimes desperately hoping, that the room they are walking into is exactly what it claims to be. I have sat in this chair for more than 30 years. I will be here tomorrow. And the law, the real law, will be here with me. Nobody is above it. Nobody ever was.